Welcome to the sixth video in this series, A Beginner's Guide to Rails 7. In this video, we're going to implement federated authentication. And what that means is that we're going to outsource our authentication to another service like Facebook or GitHub. And sometimes even if we're developing an application for like an organization or a company, they have a central authentication server that stores everybody's passwords, and we're going to use that authentication server to identify or authenticate our users inside of our application. So in this example, we're going to use OAuth to receive a unique identifier that will identify a user. So we're going to use GitHub. So we'll use OAuth to connect with GitHub, and GitHub will provide us a unique ID that identifies our user, and we're going to use that unique ID within our application to remember who this person is and log them in after they have left our website and then have come back. So we can also use, since we're using OAuth, we can get a token that will give us permission to act on behalf of our users to the site that's providing our authentication. So we could use a token that GitHub gives us, and that could allow us to create repositories or do other actions inside of GitHub. So let's get started. So after you log into GitHub, you can go down here to settings and you can view your public profile. Now this is the information that my web application will be able to get from me about my public profile when I try to create an account. So you'll notice it will be able to get my name, but not an email. You might want to add your name in here and an email if you want to your public profile. That way your application can use it. But I'm also going to show you a way that if you don't have an email, how we can handle that situation. But the first thing that we're going to need to do is scroll down here and go to our developer settings. And then we'll click on OAuth apps, and we're going to register a new application. And you probably want to name this application based on your website. So my application is called To Do Auth. And the homepage URL, this isn't too important, but since right now I am developing on my local host, I'm just going to use localhost :3000. Now we're going to do this authorization callback URL as well, and you want to put your base URL or your base domain name that you get to view your site. So if you're on Cloud9 developing, you probably want your Amazon URL to go right here. And then at the end, we want to put /auth/github/call back. And that's where, after we've done authenticating through GitHub, this is where GitHub is going to send us back to. So it's really important that you make sure this is correct, and then we'll register this application. And now you can see that we have a client ID, and we need a secret. So we're going to have to generate a new client secret. And here is my client ID and secret, and it's grayed out so that you can't see it because it is a security issue if I share it with the whole internet. But go ahead and copy and paste those into a place where you won't lose them, and we're going to add those into our code later. So next we will want to add in the OmniAuth gem. So I'm going to use the GitHub strategy, and of course if you want to use Facebook or Twitter, you can add those strategies in as well. And I highly recommend going to the OmniAuth's webpage, just search for OmniAuth gem, and to read some of the documentation. But we're also going to need the Rails CSRF protection, and that's cross-site forgery or request forgery protection that we're going to need to make sure everything is secure. So once you add those into your gem file, you need to quit your server and run bundle to install those gems. Next, we're going to need to go into this config folder, and inside of there we'll find an initializers folder. Now this is code that runs when our server first boots up, and we're going to have to add another file to set up OmniAuth. So I'm going to just call this omniauth.rb. Now you could probably copy and paste this from OmniAuth's website, but what we're going to do is set up this GitHub with our client ID and that secret. So you should paste in your client ID here and your secret here. But before you do that, if you have a public GitHub repository, you're now exposing your client ID and secret on the open internet. There's actually bots that will go out and find these, and they could do some nasty stuff on your behalf. So it's not recommended that you actually put your ID in secret in the code. Instead, we need a way to store the client ID in secret in a secure way. And the Rails has a secure way to store stuff. It's in this credentials file, but the credentials file is encrypted. And you encrypt it with this master.key file. So this master.key file is ignored and not included in your GitHub repository. So if you make changes, you need to make or move your code to a new computer, you need to somehow copy this file over manually because it won't come with the rest of your GitHub repository. So we're going to go ahead and edit this credentials file, and you can't just click it and open it up because it's a bunch of random text. So we're going to have to use Rails to edit our credentials. Now we're going to use the bin/Rails command to edit our credentials, credentials edit, but we do need an editor, and the default editor Nano doesn't usually work that well, so I use the Vim editor, and you can go ahead and press enter. And then you'll get into the editor where you can edit these credentials. You can use your arrow keys to move the cursor. The mouse won't work. And then we press the I button to enter into insert mode in Vim. And then we can put GitHub : and then press enter. Now you want to use the space bar instead of the tab. Tab does not work with this. So we'll do 2 spaces and then we'll insert the client ID. And you can paste in your client ID right there and then press enter and then put your secret as well and paste in your secret right there. And then you can press WQ or you press ESC first to exit out of insert mode, and then a : WQ will write the credentials to the file, encrypt it, and then quit your editor. And when you see file encrypted and saved, then everything went well. If you see an error message, then you might have to go in and maybe delete. If you used your tab button, then you have to delete the tabs, and then hopefully you'll get it to work with spaces instead. Now, instead of putting our client ID directly in this file, we can pull it out from the credentials file. And that we do that with the rails.application.credentials and then .github, and that's what we added in, and we use the : client ID for our client ID, and then our secret, we used secret. So those are the same keys that you put in your encrypted file. And then save that file, and once you save it, then we can restart our server with foreman, and that'll start our server. And hopefully it'll boot up just fine. That means that this code ran, and hopefully we have our GitHub OmniAuth gem all set up so that it can communicate with GitHub using the application we created on GitHub. So with that all set up, on our login page, we can add a button so that users can log in and sign up through GitHub. We'll also probably want to add the button on the sign up page, but we'll go ahead and add it on the login page. And then when we're done, we can add another one onto the sign up page. So on the sessions new view, we can add in a button that says login with GitHub that goes to /auth/GitHub. We'll make the button look like a fancy button using Bootstrap. We'll also make sure that it doesn't use Turbo, or else we won't see where the page goes to. Then refreshing our login form, we'll have that button. We'll go ahead and click on it. And now you can see that we're on Twitter or GitHub's website, and it's asking us as a GitHub user, do we want to share our data with this application? And even though we own the application, we still have to give it permission to share. And we can see that the only thing that we're giving it permission to do is view our public data. So this token actually won't be able to do anything else on GitHub other than view our public profile. So you can go ahead and click authorize. And then it says we're being redirected to our Rails application, and you can see that we went to /auth/GitHub/callback, and we're back at this Rails application. So down here, we actually have a little debug console, so we can go ahead and ask for the request.env, and then the OmniAuth.auth right there, and this is what we get back from OmniAuth, and these are all the information is able to glean from GitHub by viewing my public profile. Now, instead of that request coming back and landing in an error page because Rails doesn't know how to route that request, let's go ahead and use the generator to generate us a new controller. And this controller will be the Authentications controller. And we won't include any actions on that right off the bat, but let's go ahead and open up our routes file. And when we open up the routes file, let's go ahead and have a GET request that goes to /auth/github/callback, which is the URL that it calls back. And we'll have that request go to our authentications controller and call the create action. Now, this is only if we're new that we're only going to use GitHub, we can leave that right there, or we can put our provider right there. That way, if we're doing Facebook and Twitter as external services to authenticate a user, then it'll put whatever service we want right in there. And for this one, it will be GitHub. So now edit our authentications controller, create that create action, and down in this private area, just so I don't have to type this out so much, I'll just create a little method that will give us that hash that OmniAuth gave us back. And for now, we'll just render that out in JSON. And now let's go ahead and try this again and see if we can see all of that information in a little bit better view. So now back on our login page, we'll try clicking that button again. And if you notice, this time it skipped right over the GitHub page. We didn't even see us go to the GitHub page. That's because we already authenticated this application. But right here, we have all of the information, and this is just a fancy thing that my web browser does to show the information. But we can see that in this info, well, we have the provider being GitHub. We have a unique ID, we have our nickname, we have our full name, and all of the other information that it was able to collect off of GitHub using my public profile. Now, most likely your browser will show this data in this format here. This is just something that my browser provides to be able to see it in a little bit better format. And the information that we're going to want is, first of all, the provider. That way we know it came from GitHub. And this is if we add other providers like Facebook or Google or something. We also want to grab the unique ID, their name, and their email. And you can tell that I don't have an email because I don't have an email on my public GitHub profile. So let's go ahead and pull out this important information. There's one other piece of information that we're going to want to pull out, and that is this token right here. And we don't really need it for this video, but if we ever want to act on behalf of the users to do stuff on GitHub, then this token will give us access to do that. So I'm going to add this method into my authentications controller. And what it will do is we'll create a new empty hash, and we'll store all of those all the information that we care about in the empty hash. So we're just kind of filtering out all of the extra information they gave us, and we're also going to store it at a 1 level so that it'll all be really easy to access. So we're getting the user ID, the provider, the name, the email, and the credentials. We're also doing a little bit of protection just to make sure that this doesn't crash if we don't have certain information available. And once we do that, let's go ahead and see our output if we'll go ahead and get this user hash. So we'll go ahead and click this login with GitHub button again to test it. And you can see I just have the information that I care about. So the main two things we're going to look at is the unique ID and the provider. Now the provider for us is always going to be GitHub, but if we want to have different providers, we can definitely do that. We made the URL in our routes file customizable so we can add more providers pretty quickly. But this is the strategy moving forward. Somebody's going to click on that button. After they click on their button, we're going to land here in this create method under our authentications controller. So from there, what we're going to do is we're going to save the unique ID and the provider into the database and attach it to a user. Now, we could have a one-to-many relationship with users and authentications, or we can have a one-to-one relationship. And I'm just going to do a one-to-one and tack these on as extra fields inside of the user. But if you need something more complex, like if you want the user to connect to multiple providers at the same time, then you can create a separate database table to store the unique ID and the provider. So what we'll do is we'll query the database to see if we've seen this unique ID before, and if we have, we'll find out which user belongs to that unique ID and log them in. If we haven't seen it before, then we're going to create a new user using the name and email that we're able to collect from this, and we'll create a new user and log them in. And then when that user comes back, next time he clicks on that button, he'll land on this create again, and he'll be in the database and we'll log him in. So let's go ahead and add onto our users this unique ID and the provider. So to do that, we need to create a migration, and we're going to add a UID and provider to users. And so we're also going to add this token field, and that's just if you want to. We're not going to use this at least in this video, but if you want to save that token so you can do additional requests to GitHub and act on behalf of this user, you can. So these are all going to be string fields, so we don't have to put a database type, and then we can go ahead and add these onto our user. Now, by default, these are going to be optional fields, so they'll be null for all of our users until we create a user with this unique ID and provider. And after we check to make sure everything is correct with our migration, we can go ahead and run that migration. Now, instead of just rendering out this user hash that we have, and by the way, in case we ever need to re-see this, what we can do is we can put a return statement here. I've commented these both out, so we won't do this, but if we ever need to re-see that hash to help us out, we can take these comments out and we'll render out the JSON and then return. So what we want to do, now that we have that unique ID and provider from the user hash, what we want to do is see if we can get a user, and we'll query our users table to see if we can find a user that has this unique ID and the provider. We'll just get the first user. Hopefully we won't create more than one user with this unique ID, and we're going to trust that GitHub will not have multiple users that have the same unique ID. So once we pull that user out, we'll first check to see if we were able to find a user. That means that there was a user in this database, so we'll just log that user in. And else, what we want to do is we want to create a user with this information that we've been able to collect from the user hash. And to do that, I'm just going to say user new from hash, and we'll pass in the user hash there. And we don't need the parentheses, but we can have them if we want. Now, this is not a method that is built into Rails, so we'll have to go to the users model and create that method. So the one reason why we want to use this method, we're just creating a new user and using that hash to create the new user. But the main reason we want to use this method is the hash secure password is not going to let this user get saved in the database if the user doesn't have a password. But the full point of this is to be able to create a user account without a password and instead let GitHub be the authenticator. So in order to be able to trick hash secure password to let us save the users, this will say user.password digest equals 0. And then we'll return the user. And what this will do is it'll allow the user to get saved without a really valid password. Now, no password will ever hash to 0. So that means that nobody could try to log this user in with a real password. But this does allow the user to get saved in the database when we set that to 0. So that's why we're doing this in a method. By the way, the self up here means that this method is going to be called on the class, the user class, and not a specific user. So this is like a static method in Java. So what we'll do after we created the user is we'll go ahead and try to save this user in the database. And if he's saved in the database, then we can log him in and redirect to the root path and with a notice that says signed up. Now up here, when we log in the user, we probably also want to redirect them to the root path, and this notice means that they're already signed up and we're going to log them in. Now what happens if the user is not able to be saved in the database? And you might be thinking, well, why can't we save this user in the database? And it could be because this user does not have a name or an email that we're able to collect from GitHub because they don't have that on their public profile. So we need a strategy to manage that, and that's what's going to happen with my profile because I don't have an email. So what we'll do is we'll take the user hash and we'll save it into the session, and we're going to redirect them to the sign up path, which is the form to create a new user, and we'll add a notice saying, please add the missing information. And that's because we're not able to collect all the information we needed from GitHub. So we're going to the user controller, and this is where we're redirecting them. And normally we just create a new user without anything in that user. But what we can do is we could say, if in our session we happen to have this user hash that we collected from GitHub, and then what we can do is we can create a user that will do the new from hash, and we'll go ahead and pass in this session user hash there. So we'll go ahead and create the user, and we'll fill in all the information we had from GitHub. And if there isn't anything in the session, then we'll just go ahead and create a empty user. Now, one other thing that we want to do is we want to run the validations on this user. So we'll go ahead and try to, when we do this, user.valid, that will cause the validations to run and all the errors will be pointed out to us. Now let's go ahead and try logging in with GitHub. And we can see that it says, please add the missing information. And we can see that we have our email that doesn't need to be filled in. The only problem is we also have password fields. And that's because this is the normal sign up form that normally requires a password. But if you notice, there aren't any errors with the password being blank. And that's because we set the password digest to 0. And we really don't want these password fields to show up when they're signing up with GitHub, but we do want them to show up when they're signing up with a password. So how are we going to manage that? So back in the user model, we're going to add this new method called hasPassword. And really, maybe it could read should have password. So these are users that require that there be a password field. If there isn't a password digest set, that means there is no password and the user needs to enter in a password. Now, by setting it to 0, this will be false, meaning they don't have a password. Now, the other thing is if the self.password digest does not equal 0. So if the password digest is equal to 0, then that means that we don't need them to have a password. And since password digests are going to be stored as a string, we better put quote marks around this. But now we can call this method, and if this method returns false, that means that the user signed up, or at least is trying to sign up through GitHub. And if this method returns true, that means they're signing up and they do require a password. So back on the new users form, this is our sign up form. What we can do is just conditionally show those passwords. So if the user has a password or should have a password, then we'll show the password fields. And if they don't have a password, then we'll skip those over. And so if we refresh this, now the user hash is still stored in the session. So if we refresh this, we'll see that our password fields are no longer there. Now there's still one issue with this create method in that the create method is only going to add the user params, and if they're signing up through GitHub, that's only going to be the name and the email. We're not going to have the unique ID or the provider, and it's also not going to have a password, so when you try to save it, it's going to crash. So what we need to do is we need to check to see if we have the the user hash in the session. And if we don't have a user hash in the session, then we'll just create the user the same way we did before using the parameters from the form. But if there is a user in the session, then we'll have to say the user is a user.new from hash. That way we assign the unique ID and the provider and set the password digest to 0. So we'll pass in the session user hash here. But now the name and the email from the form will not be added to this user. So let's just do that manually. We'll set the username to our user params and the name and the email as well. And then one last thing we need to do is after we save this user hash will still be stuck in the session, and that will be until the user closes their browser tab. We don't need it anymore, so let's just go ahead and delete the user hash out of the session by setting it to nil. So all we have to do is now provide an email so we can create this form, and when we click sign up, it says we're successfully signed up. Now, this was the account that we created through GitHub. Let's go ahead and also just check to make sure we can create an account for a user with a password, make sure we didn't break anything. And that worked as well. So after logging Larry out, now we could try to log in with our GitHub user. So instead of having a password, we can just click this button and it will log in with GitHub. And what we didn't see is we went to GitHub, our browser got redirected to GitHub. GitHub realized I was already logged in, it knew who I was, it knew I already authorized this application. So it sent me right back to the create method and the authenticate controller, and that logged me in and redirected me to the root path, and now I'm logged in. So a lot of kind of redirections happen there behind the scenes, but as a user, it just looked seamless. I clicked the button and it logged me in without a password. So now let's review everything we built in this project just to get a big overview of how it all works. So after the user clicks the Login with GitHub button, they'll land on this create page as long as they approve our application to be able to read their public profile. So once they approve it, we will have all the information in their public profile, and we'll in this auth hash right here, and then this just boils it down to the information we care about. So we have this user hash with all the information. We're going to look at the unique ID and the provider, which will be GitHub, and we're going to see if there's a user in the database with that unique ID and provider. If there is a user in the database, then we'll log them in and redirect them to the root path. And so that's what you saw me just do, how I logged my GitHub user in, went through this path right here. But if we don't find a user with a unique ID and provider, then we'll try to create a new user from the information from GitHub. Now, if they have a name and an email in their public profile, then we'll be able to save them and redirect them and say, hey, you've signed up. But since my user did not have an email, and when we tried to save them, that save failed. So what we did is we saved all the information that we cared about, this user hash, we save it into the session, and then we redirect them to the sign up page saying, please add the missing information. And so that's the new action in the user's controller. And here we check to see if we saved the user hash. And if we did, we'll create a new user with that hash. And this sets the password digest to 0, so this user doesn't need a password. And we validate the user just so that the errors show up. And if there isn't a user hash, then we just fall back to creating a user with a password. And so this just creates a blank user for the form to use. And then when they submit the form, if there is this user hash, we'll grab all the information from that user hash, attach it to the new user, get the name and the email from the form, and attach that to the new user as well. Of course, if they're not logging in through GitHub, then we'll just grab the information that they submitted with the form that will include a password and password confirmation. If we're able to save that user in the database, we'll just delete this hash out. We don't need it anymore. redirect them to the root path, and it'll say you have successfully signed up. If we couldn't save them, that means maybe their email was missing or their name was missing or something. So we'll just redirect them back to or re-render the form out for them to fix that. And so now we have Federated login implemented. Now we'll probably want to put this link, this is on our login page, and we'll probably just want to copy that link and go to our users new page. This is our sign up page, and add the link there. And instead of login with GitHub, we can say sign up with GitHub. It's the same link. It goes to the same spot, goes through the same action, but now they have a button on the sign up page. And it seems like all is well, but there is one final issue that we're going to have to deal with. So let's say I log out and I go to log back in, and it's been a week or two, and I forgot that I used the login with GitHub page. And so I try to log in the test at github.com user, and I try to put in a password here, and I click login, and we crash. And if you notice, this is a bcrypt error. That's because the 0 is not a valid hash, and we're trying to authenticate with it, and that causes bcrypt to crash. And back in our sessions controller, when we try to log in a user with a password, we call this authenticate method, and that's what's going to crash for users that do not have a password. But what we can do is we can rescue, and this is like a try and catch block in other languages, but in Ruby, this rescues, and if we crash, then this will rescue. And in this case, we can redirect them to the login path with an alert, invalid password, and then just kind of remind them, did you log in or sign up with GitHub? So now if the user tries to log in with a password, it says invalid password, did you sign up with GitHub? And they're like, oh yeah, maybe I did. And they can click the login with GitHub button and they'll be logged in. So that concludes this video. We now have federated login implemented. And the next video, we'll look at some automated testing.